Москве все не так, как надо. Да еще раз, да еще раз, да еще много.
A very warm welcome in the Balie, everybody. It's sold out on a Saturday afternoon, so we're quite happy about that. The music you were listening to when you walked in was Vladimir Vysotsky. If I now say he's a famous Russian songwriter, that will mean that I had heard of him. I had not, but everybody who lived in Russia for longer than 1 year has. Vladimir Putin, when he was young, in his late teens, was playing his songs on the guitar. I know this because it's in Stephen Lee Meyers' book on page 26. Once you get to page 26, you have 600 more pages to go. Stephen Lee Meyers wrote an excellent book, Putin, the New Tsar, about Putin. Also a very robust book about a very robust president. And we'll get to talk about him for the next hour and a half. 1 hour, or actually half an hour from now, 3 people on the stage will have written a book on Putin. I am the only one who has not. Because joining us after Stephen's introduction will be Wiert Duk, former Russia correspondent, Russia watcher. He's over there. And Hubert Smeets, also a former Russia correspondent. And over the past 2 years, both of them wrote a book about Vladimir Putin as well. But let me first introduce our main speaker. He will be introducing his book for about 20 minutes. Stephen Lee Meyers is a New York Times veteran. He has worked for the paper for the past 26 years, I believe. He's still traveling the globe a bit. He used to work a lot in Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, places like that. Nowadays, Stephen is based in Washington as a national security correspondent for the New York Times, but he's still traveling around as well. He lives in Washington. That's where he boarded a plane yesterday, especially to join us here today. So give him a warm applause, Stephen Lee Meyers.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon now. It's a great thrill to be here in this institution. I've not been before, but my colleagues who know Amsterdam and the Netherlands all were thrilled when I told them that I had the chance to come here. So thank you very much for having me. By way of introducing this book, that is not an easy task to do in a matter of minutes. Vladimir Putin, I think, is probably the singular most important leader of any country in the world today. And I include my own country. You know, our presidents, they come and go. We have Barack Obama now. I know that more or less a year and 2 weeks from now, we'll have a new president. And you know, it's simply as important as our presidents are. It's not the same magnitude of the power that Putin has, the unique individual power that he has over his own country, which is partly why I named the book the way I did. One of the things that struck me when I set out to do this was how much, even now, even today, in recent events in the last couple of months in Syria in particular, Vladimir Putin seems to confound people, surprise them even though he's somebody who's now been on the world stage as long as he has. I mean, at the center of Russian politics, he still seems an enigmatic figure. When I started researching this, I went back and I looked up, of course, you know, all of the events around his selection as president. And I say selection deliberately. Boris Yeltsin was flailing about at the end of his administration in the 90s, really fearing for his own personal safety, and was looking for somebody who could preserve that, literally, I think. but certainly legally, he was worried that he would face prosecution, that he was under political threat. Leaders in Russia over its long history have not left office easily. And so I think Boris Yeltsin was very concerned about that and was looking for somebody who could protect him on his way out the door. And he found that in Vladimir Putin. And yet, when I went back, I looked at the New York Times story from August of 1999 when he was appointed prime minister. And that story began, Vladimir who? Even within the political elite of Russia, there was not a clear sense of who was this man that Yeltsin has plucked. I mean, at the time, he was the head of the Federal Security Service, not an unimportant position, of course, but not one in the center of the public eye, partly by design. It's an intelligence agency, domestic security agency. But anyway, here we are 16 years later, and in some respects, certainly in the United States, around the events with Syria, I found people asking the same question. Who is Vladimir Putin? And, I wrote a book to try to answer that question. And admittedly, it's not an easy one. I remember reading a couple years ago one of Putin's political advisors, which understates the role. Somebody who's important in his image making, somebody who's really created the president in some respects. It's a guy named Gleb Pavlovsky. We would call him a political operative in our system. I don't know how you would describe that exactly here, but somebody, a spin doctor, who creates the persona of a candidate for the public consumption. And he was more than anyone, I think, instrumental in creating Putin's image early on, when he was Vladimir who, and was important in creating, in fact, the popular president he became, especially in his early years. And the Pavlovsky, though, at this point, many years later, had broken with Putin in some respects, and no longer revered him, no longer worked for him inside the Kremlin. And in a very long interview he did with a Russian paper, he described him, this is in 2012, he described him as a zero, a cipher, sort of an unknowable figure, which was really striking for somebody who had personally worked with him as long as he had, to describe him in that way. But tellingly, he described him as a mirror or a screen through which people view the leader himself, Putin, but also who view Russia. So people look into him and they see him as their hopes, but also they see their fears in him. And it's almost as if Putin is defined by the perception of the viewer as much as the reality. Many of the books that have been written, certainly in English, some in Russian as well, that I've read, I find them all to be dissatisfying to some degree, some better than others, of course, but because they are that refraction of the leader. It's almost as much about the author as it is about Putin himself. And, of course, I'm as guilty of that as anyone else, but I tried very hard to try to understand him in something closer to an objective way without as best I could projecting my own views or perspectives onto him. And this is the result that I have here. I think, most people in this room probably remember the first encounter with one of my presidents, George Bush and Putin. And George Bush, who for many reasons was ridiculed, but in one particular instance, he said he had looked into Putin's eyes and seen his soul. And he really wished he could have that back. And I know many people have ridiculed him over the years and often remember this. But in fact, it was an interesting encounter the two leaders had, and a very different time, by the way. It was in 2001, right before the attacks of September of 11, which of course changed everything in my country and the world, I think, to some degrees. But in this meeting, it was interesting to read Bush's account of it, told many years later, when he regretted some of what he'd said. But the way that Putin had approached it, in the same way that Pavlovsky was describing, Putin very much was the screen that Bush saw, what he wanted to see. And he based that on an intelligence briefing that he had had before the two of them met, which described a great moment in Putin's biography, really the low moment in his life, which was in August of 1996. And it's a very different Putin than you see now. I'm struck, and still I marvel at the fact that this incident happened in August of 1996, and 3 years later he was made prime minister. 3 months after that he was made president, and here we are now. But Putin had been a deputy mayor in St. Petersburg after he left East Germany. I could talk for an hour about East Germany, but he served as a deputy in Petersburg for one of the great Russian Democrats who emerged in the Perestroika era, Anatoly Sobchak, had served him loyally. I think, honestly, if history had been a little bit different, he would be serving him today as a loyal deputy. Putin did not have ambitions to be president, which is something that's very striking and important to understand about him, I think. Anyway, Anatoly Sobchak, in what was a new democratic Russia, actually had to face re-election, which happens in democracies. And much to Putin's dismay, one of his colleagues, another deputy mayor, challenged Anatoly Sobchak in the election. And Putin simply couldn't understand how that was possible, how somebody could do that. He considered it the worst kind of betrayal. He publicly called him a Judas. It really, I think, colored Putin's understanding of democracy when this Judas won the election. Putin, as much as he said he didn't want to work for the guy, actually he kind of wanted a job after all anyway, and the Judas wasn't about to give him one, so he was out of work, and he was kind of flailing about looking for something to do, perhaps in Moscow. Things weren't going well. It was the summer. There was turmoil in Moscow on a national level because of Yeltsin's re-election campaign, which was quite scandalous. So Putin was sort of out of work, out of luck, seemed to be at rock bottom, and he had retreated to his dacha, which I think most people here will know are the summer houses that many Russians have. Not a particularly fancy summer home, but nonetheless a place where he could retreat to. And he did, and he was sitting there contemplating his future when his dacha burned down. This was the low moment of his life, I think. Perhaps even as much as the events of 1991 or 1989. But Putin tells a story, a great story, and it may be just a story, but of finding in the ashes of his dacha a cross, an aluminum cross that his mother had given him. And it was a baptismal cross that, according to his story, he didn't know about until, in fact, after the end of the Soviet Union, and she asked him to take it to Jerusalem to have been blessed, which he did. And Bush, who was a great believer himself, was quite moved by this story. And when they had this first meeting, he interrupted him, Putin, to say, "Vladimir, tell me about the cross." And Putin apparently was quite taken aback by this, because he often said, and it's often been written, that that he always wore this cross, but in fact he wasn't wearing it that day. But Putin, being very fast on his feet, explained the story to Bush. Bush was quite moved by it, and then this is why Bush came out and talked about his soul, I think. Bush, again, is ridiculed for that, among many other reasons. But it's important, I think, to understand exactly what Bush said, because it wasn't as bad as it sounded. I won't do the accent all the way through, but he said, "I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy." We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul. He didn't say he saw the soul as much as it's been characterized in the press, especially. But he said Putin was a man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country. And I don't think Bush was that wrong about that. I mean, I think that Putin's motivations, even as he was projecting onto, an image onto a screen that Bush would appreciate, quite deftly, by the way, I think, Bush was not wrong in assessing what ultimately his motivation is. And I've seen this in person when we, with the New York Times, had an interview with Putin once, and my editor came from New York because I was a mere bureau chief, at that point. It took more to meet the leader. But a couple days before we had this interview, I got a panicked message from the Kremlin saying, we need a history of the New York Times. How am I was somewhat flabbergasted by this request, and so I didn't know what to do, and I just made one up. But, I said when the paper was founded, I said it was the greatest newspaper in the world, of course, and what its circulation was. But I said that it was owned by the Sulzberger family and had been for, I think, since 1898. I'm even forgetting the dates now. But the Sulzbergers are a great family. They own and operate a great institution, and they do it as much for the love and for the public service as they do for, the commercial enterprise. I mean, I'm sure they want to make money, but nonetheless, they treat it as a public service. And we went into this, and I sent this off to the Kremlin, and we went into the meeting with Putin, and he began by courting Bill Keller and telling him what a great institution the New York Times was, what its circulation was, and how the Sulzberger family operated it as a public trust. And if only, God willing, Russian businessmen, by the way, who he was already oppressing, had treated their newspapers as such, maybe the Russian media would be as great and as free as the American. Anyway, Bill Keller, who is no slouch, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who'd been in Moscow, has been around the world, was completely enchanted by this encounter. And it was only afterwards that I was able to explain to him what had happened. But it nonetheless shows the way that Putin is able to engage people and come across. Somebody asked me yesterday, would I say he was charming? And I wouldn't, but you could see how he is able to be quite an engaging leader and use the information that he has, marshal facts, marshal the information he has about the person on the other side of the table, much in the way an intelligence officer does, to great effect in either presenting an image or portraying himself in a way that the listener wants to hear. And this, you see how, at least early on, Bush was so engaged by him at what was, importantly, a very different era. You see him, the way he's done this, also in some of the other meetings that he's done. You see much less rapport now, I think. There's a great story that's told about his first meeting with Angela Merkel, who he was meeting because somebody he admired very much, Gerhard Schroeder, also had been thrown out by elections. He really seems to distrust this institution of democracy because it keeps unelecting people that he admires. But in the case of Merkel, he brought in his beloved Labrador. I don't know if they showed it up here earlier, but the Merkel, being very much afraid of dogs, was not so pleased, supposedly, and he said to her, I know everything about you. So he was, in a less positive way perhaps, sending a message through the intelligence experience that he has. I tried, and I know I should wrap this up, but I tried once again to have another interview with him, specifically for the book. This was late in 2014, and at that point there were the tensions over events in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea and so forth. But after months of trying, I finally sat down with his spokesperson to make my last pitch, and failed. I mean, at this point, Putin doesn't want to talk to me anymore. But Dmitry Peskov is a spokesperson, an affable enough guy, but he told me, you don't need to talk to the leader anymore, and he refers to them that way. He said everything you could want to know, which I thought was strange, but I tried to talk about the experience, his family's experience during the war, which in fact I don't know everything I'd like to know. But nonetheless, it wasn't going to happen. But he said, Peskov said, go and read his speeches. They're all there for you to have on the website, Kremlin.ru, if you're interested. 16 years of speeches are there. I wouldn't recommend it. But I, essentially I did. As much as people look at him and are confounded by him, confused by what he represents, or by his own efforts, very skillful efforts, to present a certain image to the world, to his domestic audience. I think there's something in what Peskov says, is that he has said everything, and that you can learn a lot and shouldn't be so surprised by reading or listening to what he says. And that's true to this day. If you can endure one of his 4-hour press conferences, you will actually learn something from them. It's difficult because Putin, I'll say bluntly, has not always been very honest. That is especially true right now. I actually admired, and I always thought of this, how artfully he could not lie. Up until recently, and it was only after the events in Ukraine that he was actually caught out in some pretty bad lies, including about the role of Russian troops in Crimea, which he since corrected, and others. But nonetheless, I think that if you pay attention, you can understand Putin a lot more, and it's just simply a matter of making the effort instead of seeing what it is he wants you to see, whether you're a friend of his or an enemy of his. So anyway, in doing this endeavor, I came across a television interview he did a long time ago. And when I read it, I doubt anyone here will be able to guess when he said it, but it's quite striking. But he did this interview. It's important television. He understood early on the role of television in shaping his image, and it does very much to this day in Russia. But he said in this interview, and I'll wrap up with this, no matter how sad, no matter how terrible it sounds, I believe that a turn towards totalitarianism for a period of time is possible in our country. The danger, though, should not be seen in the organs of law enforcement, the security services, the police, or even the army. He never blames the security services. He went on, the danger is in the mentality of our own people, in our very own mentality. It seems to all of us, and I will admit to me sometimes as well, that by imposing strict order with an iron fist, we will all begin to live better, more comfortably, more securely. That to me is the essence of Putin's vision and strategy. But in this interview, he went on. He said in actual fact, that comfort would very quickly pass because that iron fist would very quickly begin to strangle us. And when I look at Russia today, I was just there most recently in July. I have many friends still in Russia. I have many who've left. Many are now in DC. It's sort of a reunion of sorts to be in DC among Russia watchers these days. I see that strangling is what's happening. Putin said that in November of 1991. The Soviet Union still existed. And early on, I think he both was insightful about the kind of country Russia would become, but also the dangers of that. And with that, I'll wrap up, and I thank you again very much. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that introduction. When you say that he started becoming more dishonest when he started spreading lies when he invaded Crimea, basically.
Well, I wouldn't say he started then.
Right. But before that, you could take him at his word more than recently.
I do think that's true.
What triggered that? What happened?
I think it's the events. I think it's partly the pressure that he felt, particularly in light of those events. The annexation of Crimea, for all of Russia's efforts to defend it, is a violation of international law.
And he knows so.
I'm sorry?
He knows that, obviously.
I think he must know that. And the last country to annex another, I often stump people with this, is Iraq, when they invaded and annexed Kuwait. And the world did not look kindly on that. And in fact, it was reversed with a military operation that the Soviet Union authorized as part of the Security Council. And so I think that the intervention in Crimea was something that was a very emotional response, a decision that was taken within a very small group of people without the consultation of legal advisors who might have cautioned. And
that group becomes smaller and smaller.
That group is, I'm told, very small now. And not unlike somebody pointed out to me the decision that was made in 1979 to invade Afghanistan, also a secret operation involving special forces that was denied at the time by a very small group of people within the Politburo.
Do you believe the Crimea operation is something he regrets?
No.
Not at all?
One of the things that's very striking about it, and there are a lot of historical reasons why Crimea is very important to the Russian the empire, first of all. It's sort of founding mythology in the way in our country the conquest of the American West was. It's very important and very mythological in that sense. But also there are strategic reasons for it. And he looked at what was happening in Ukraine as, wrongly I think, a Western instigated coup, and that coup would eventually threaten the Black Sea Fleet that's based there, and as well as the Russian-speaking population there. And simply for a lot of, I think, personal reasons, as well as historical ones, he sort of felt like we can't let this happen, and made a very rash decision very quickly, under pressure, again with a very small group of people. And now, to this day, Russia is living with the consequences of that, hoping somehow, I think, that they can get the world beyond it, and I don't think it will be so easy to do.
There's no world leader where we feel an urge to psychologize what's going on in his head, more so than with Putin, it seems.
I was going to say, we do that plenty with our own president,
well, yeah,
Barack Obama,
when he
right
starts
now.
crying, but not as much, I think, as with Putin. I mean, what struck me in your book, in a way, in the beginning, you described him as an accidental president. You said he didn't have the ambition to become president. When you look at this photo, and we'll see some more footage later on, it does seem like somebody with ambition. He obviously didn't take this picture himself, but I'm sure he doesn't mind being portrayed this way.
I'm
so
told
what
he
happened?
likes this picture,
Right.
which surprised me. This was taken by a photographer, Platon, when Putin was made Man of the Year, Person of the Year by Time magazine in 2007.
So why does he like being portrayed like this?
I think power is good for you.
Right.
You might sit like that if you'd been president of Russia for
We'll see.
7 years at that point. He's certainly grown into the job. I mean, there's no question about it. It's just I was struck by, and I continue to be, I marvel over the accidents of history that put him into that position to become president.
When you research somebody's life and you start with his birth, basically, and his youth, and you cover his tracks all the way to now, you must learn to not only understand him more and his motives, but maybe, in a way, appreciate him more. You said, and you did, that you wrote a very objective book, but when you get to know your protagonist, I'm sure you get a sense of where he stands. And is that the case with you as well? That some of the things he did, that the West got really angry with, that you kind of see where he came from now?
Yeah, very much so. One of the problems I've had personally speaking, with books about, or even coverage generally. I mean, I love our coverage at the New York Times of Russia, of course, but the coverage of Putin, particularly in the West and in our country, can sometimes become a caricature, a cartoon. One of my great friends, Nina Khrushcheva, said recently at an event that, Putin is the ultimate Bond villain.
She's the daughter.
She's the great-granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev. Yeah, she's a great friend, a great academic, a historian in her own right. And but this idea of Putin as Bond villain, they've incorporated him as a villain into one of our TV serials that's on now, House of Cards. And, and I mean, he contributes to it by going around shirtless, by posing like this. But nonetheless, it's that cartoon version isn't really helpful in understanding Russia today, certainly, but even in understanding him. And, again, he contributes to that problem with the way that he manipulates his own image in the Kremlin media and the stunts that he does. He plays hockey and scores goal after goal after goal. It's remarkable what happens to that goalie. He just freezes when the president is skating at him and can't stop a puck. And we watch that and we ridicule it. We all laugh about it. But understanding why he does that, why that is popular in Russia, strangely, and is important to understanding why he commands the authority that he does. I believe our administration right now thinks that Putin is weak, that you can sanction him if you're smart enough about sanctions, and that will somehow erode his political power base.
They're wrong.
And they're wrong, because I think you need to understand better why he is perceived. You can overestimate his popularity, I think, because in Russia, where there is generally speaking, an enormous distrust of strangers, and given the historical legacy we all know, and if somebody calls you on the telephone and asks a stranger and asks you what you think of the leader, I'm amazed that 10% of the people will say they don't approve of his work as president. So. I think that what I tried to do when I talk about being more objective about it is, trying to understand him from his own point of view, but also from the point of view of his history, his country's history.
What's the big question mark that's left? I'm sure you didn't uncover everything. You mentioned something, but what is the thing that you can't get your...
There are two main topics. Well, I would add a third, but the two main ones that are almost impossible for anybody, including Russian journalists, to touch are his money and his love life.
So two important things.
Exactly, very important to most of us. But those are verboten topics, and there are a lot of rumors around them. I think there's some evidence in both cases of various aspects, and I think we know enough about them generally. But nonetheless, those are tough topics. The other one I would add is, his Secret Service background in the KGB. I don't think he had that stellar a career. He actually was not a James Bond type figure in the intelligence services. But nonetheless, a lot of that is secret. A lot of what we do know about what happened in East Germany, where he served for 5 years, comes from the Stasi files, which were opened. And the KGB files have not been opened and will not be for a long time, at least not all of them. And I think that's going to be true with some of the events that we've seen, including what happened in Crimea, including what happened with the Malaysian airliner. Maybe someday those records will emerge, but it won't happen in Putin's lifetime, therefore it probably won't happen in mine. So, that's for other historians to write about.
Even though there's one incident that's, I guess it's in every book about Putin and yours as well, when he's stationed in Dresden, as a KGB agent, the wall has come down. There's an angry mob circling around the KGB headquarters, and this tiny little guy, Vladimir Putin, steps out and addresses these angry people, basically warns them to stay put. Is that a consequential moment in his
I would
life
say
or career?
I would say that and the burning down of the dacha are probably two of the most important events in his life. And it is part of the Putin mythology, and some of the stories that I've read about it are actually quite entertaining. Great stories. None of him being shirtless, but I've seen descriptions of him holding a weapon, brandishing an AK-47 at the top of the stairs as the crazy East Germans were storming in. But I went to Dresden and I tried as best I could to find out what happened that night. And again, there are some records from his work with the Stasi, but I actually found somebody who was in the crowd. And it wasn't a mob. It was a small group, a few dozen people. But nonetheless, a much larger crowd around the street, around the corner, was going through the Stasi headquarters. They'd actually breached the walls, and at that point, you knew the Stasi control of East Germany had collapsed. And he was utterly dismayed by this, and talks about it. One of his oldest friends told me how upset he was, personally upset, by what he considered to be a failure of protecting their brethren in the security services there. Putin himself describes the Stasi, notorious secret service, describing them as part of society, and he couldn't understand why society turned on them, which is very important because he believes in security being an important part of course, any government, any society, and so he can't understand how an oppressive one could somehow be seen as doing anything other than their best for the country. And I think that's how he viewed his service in the KGB. I think that's how he views what we see as very restrictive measures against dissent, against public assembly, free speech, and so forth in Russia today. He sees we need to control that in order to protect our country, and that's what patriots do.
And that's sincere. I mean, he actually...
I don't doubt his sincerity. It's not cynical. That's what he believes. And the notion of the mob is something that is terrifying to him. And when Putin tells this story, he describes people with like bloodshed eyes and raving about tunnels under the KGB or the Stasi prison that was there. I've seen the prison. It's a horrifying place. It's preserved as a museum now, but in his mind, that's where bad people went. It wasn't this fearful object the way it was for many East Germans. And so when he describes this mob, it's like this frenzied rage that was, about to burst in and take all of their files. He seemed to be very obsessed with the files inside, which of course dealt with whom they had dealings with inside Germany, but also among other, even spying on the East Germans, which of course the KGB did, not just on the people, but the Stasi itself. And in the end, what Putin did was brave. He was alone. He couldn't find his boss. He wasn't the chief of this outpost in Dresden. It was a very small place, and
the whole mob could have jumped him.
Yeah, they could have. But as a guy named Siegfried Danath was the one who was there, and described it to me that they were euphoric. They weren't enraged or crazy. They had just overthrown. I mean, the Berlin Wall had fallen. Germany was on its way to reunification, and they've finally gotten into the Stasi thing. And that you can imagine what it would feel like that grip on society broke. And he said they were, the mood was jubilant. They went to this place hoping they would get in there, but then they realized this is a KGB thing. That's a Soviet officer. Putin came out, was very calm, didn't shout, had no weapon, had no hat. Just said, this is a protected diplomatic facility, you have to leave, we'll protect it. And he said, let's not pick a fight. That's how he described the evening. And so I trust the first-hand account more than some of the more dramatic ones that have been told. But nonetheless, a very dramatic moment for him, because Putin had called the Soviet military base there asking for reinforcements. They wanted to send a unit of soldiers, which eventually did come. But for a while, he couldn't get anybody sent over. And he tells this story, it's often cited, of the officer that he reached on the phone saying that he had no instructions. and in the Soviet way, without instructions, you could do nothing.
So it was shocking to him.
And it was shocking. And the response the officer said was, Moscow is silent. And that notion that the central authority could be silent in the face of a threat is something that Putin, I believe, never wants to repeat again. Yeah.
Before I ask our other guests to join us, one more question. How much access did you get while writing the book? How close did you get? Because I'm sure you interviewed him once with Bill Keller, but I'm sure if Putin didn't want his inner circle to talk to you, they probably wouldn't, or am I wrong?
It's a great question, because as I explained, I tried to get in to interview him again, specifically for some of the more biographical stuff about his family and so forth. I think it's reflective that they in the Kremlin don't really want him to be in an interactive, interview process where, he doesn't have complete control. He does some of these. He was on, I did an interview during his last visit to the United States with one of our TV anchors, Charlie Rose, who's an admirable interviewer and tried a little bit to get at him. But I think they understood, they knew, of course, what I was writing and probably reading it as I was writing in Moscow. But they didn't want to allow it. And yet, even after this episode with Peskov, when he said no, I met one of his oldest friends, Roldugan, who's a cellist in Petersburg, and I don't doubt that he told his friend that he was sitting down to talk with me, and he was really quite frank about Putin's personal life, his marriage, the fact that Putin has a grandson, which is, as far as I know, still not been reported in the Russian media, because you just don't go there. You don't talk about his family very much. And so through that, I feel like I got fairly close to him. There are other people like Vladimir Yakunin, who ran the railroads, a very close friend of his from the early part of the 90s, who was very helpful also in talking, very much an ideologue, anti-Western, but nonetheless helped me understand. So, I would have loved to have had another chance to sit down with him for 4 hours as we did the first time.
Right.
Because, again...
4 hours the first time?
Yeah,
wow.
with when Keller was there. And, I've been in other roundtable interviews with him, and he can be a very engaging interlocutor. You can have a serious conversation with him about anything. Not always frank, and certainly not personal so much, but he's very intriguing that way. His command of detail, the way he's able to marshal facts to make an argument for Russia's interests, can be quite engaging, quite interesting to observe.
I'd like to welcome our other two Putin watchers. In the meantime, we'll look at something that we've already discussed a little bit, the soft, erotic side of Vladimir Putin, or the way he likes to portray himself with horses and swimming pools. Let's take a look.
You're simply the best, better than all the rest, better than anyone I've ever met. I'm stuck on your heart, I hang on every word you say, tears apart.
He's even good at barbecuing.
Driving at once.
The hockey part was missing, but you said so. The goalie was frozen.
Somebody told me to look at the weights in that scene where he's working out with his prime minister, Dmitry Medvedev. That was just a few months ago. It's very small weights.
It's 2 kilos.
Very, very small weights on it, which is important to understanding these stunts sometimes, because we don't really know how fast that Formula One car was going.
Right. Was he driving?
It might not have been him, actually.
If he was driving, then
you see him pull away, but some of the other stunts over the years, one of the very early ones was in the first days of the Chechen War, the Second Chechen War, when he had just become president. And people wrote about it as though he had flown the jet there. And, I've flown in the back of a fighter jet, but I was in the back throwing up while the pilot was, doing what pilots do. So, but people will write about it. They'll say he flew with the cranes. But in fact, as you saw, there was a skilled pilot behind him.
It's not all that different from George Bush and his mission accomplished.
Exactly.
When
Though I think
Iraq
no
war.
one ever, or at least Bush
Believed
himself,
that he was flying.
wouldn't have tried to say that he, though he
No,
was
he
in
was wearing
fact
the
a pilot himself.
Right.
But even so.
It's very important about the way the Russians perceive males.
Exactly. I was going to ask. We're laughing at this in the West, but
They don't laugh,
why are
they-
these images relevant in
Because
Russia?
Russia is a very macho society, and they think that the mujik, which is the man, has to be able to do things like this, and they are very proud of Putin, actually, that he is driving Formula One cars and that he's doing all the things that he's doing, because it makes him a strong leader, and which is a big difference from the leader they had in the 90s, Boris Yeltsin, which was an alcoholic, who was an alcoholic, and he was sick. And it's impossible to understand the phenomenon of Putin without talking about the 90s. And I had the advantage to be a correspondent in the 90s in Russia. So I've witnessed the collapse of the Soviet Union and of Russia, of the Russian state and the Russian society. And because of this, actually, it is not that amazing that a person like Putin became president and that he's so popular among the Russians.
Would you agree?
Yes, but I don't agree with Weird about drinking, because that's also quite...
Yeah, but he
Way
was
of
drinking, but he
Right.
became sick. Normally,
Yeah, that was
you
the problem.
drink.
That was the problem. He couldn't stand. He couldn't stand anymore the drinking. But the drinking was not the problem with Yeltsin. The problem with Yeltsin was that he sold out the Russian Empire.
Of course. But
that was the
idea of the man.
And that was the failure of the European project of Yeltsin and Gorbachev. I think.
But it's
Not the
obvious from your book as well that the 90s and what happened in the Yeltsin period was crucial to Putin rising to power. I mean, without it was
Well,
a
it
trauma.
has been
basically.
crucial for everything that we are witnessing now. I mean, the whole concept of democracy. In the 90s, when I was a correspondent in the 90s, the talk was all about democracy. But democracy, in their eyes, what was happening to Russia, which was, in their eyes of the Russians, the sellout of the Soviet Union and the Russians, actually to corrupt businessmen who were actually gang leaders, like this guy Khodorkovsky, who is now one of the famous heroes of the West. But actually, at the time, he was just a corrupt businessman, like all these oligarchs. What the Russian public was seeing was that they were becoming poor. Their money was useless, worthless. And all of this in the name of... There was actually civil wars going on in the Caucasus. So it was chaos. And nothing is for a Russian as disturbing as chaos. Chaos in the country for a Russian is there has to be order and stability, like what Putin is now bringing to the country. Chaos is the reversal of what the Russian mind can accept.
And that comes from your book as well, I guess. It's Putin basically says it's either me or chaos, and I'm the one thing.
And he's right, probably.
The one thing I would say about what you both said is I agree with you both, is that Yeltsin his problem wasn't just drinking. I think it was unfair the way he was portrayed. But Yeltsin was a Democrat, I believe. And he made a lot of mistakes, and it was an extraordinarily corrupt time in the 90s. But Putin also, when he came to power, pursued the European path. And to this day, he will tell you that Russia is still on that European path. I think that
How did he
He's
pursue?
also telling that the future of Russia is in the East.
How did he
Exactly.
pursue the European path?
He has
Just for
been
my
rejected by it.
If
He
you
feels
look
that
at
he's rejected by the West.
he feels like he's been rejected by it, that it's
And
the
he is.
West that pushed him away, and that came much later.
But what did he
I
try?
think
How did he walk the European path?
If you look early on in the relations with the United States in particular, but certainly also with Germany and Europe, was seeking an accommodation. In the Cold War, there was a...
Well, look at 9/11. What happened?
9/11, of course, and the serious
overflights.
cooperation that they gave, including intelligence information to the United States to go after the Taliban.
Central Asian bases.
And the bases, and that continued even under Medvedev in allowing us to withdraw from Afghanistan through Lenin's hometown. by the way.
This
And
guy feels rejected as a lover.
he feels rejected by it, and so that's where I disagree. That I think that the European course wasn't just Yeltsin's; it was Putin's in the beginning.
Then if you
Yeah,
feel
yeah,
rejected, the answer may be either revenge or smart
Well, of course.
new strategies. So
What Putin was trying to do was to cooperate with the West in a typical Russian way, which is realpolitik. So you have your interest, you have in your sphere of influence, and the West has its sphere of influence. But the point is, the West was interfering in the sphere of influence, which is the Russian thinking, of course, by getting to the Russian frontiers with NATO, by inviting 6 former Soviet republics into a more or less bizarre kind of cooperation with the EU, the Eastern Partnership, which is now such a problem in Ukraine. So the West and Putin, they played completely different rules. And which was escalating, of course, with the NATO expansion, and then 2 years ago in Ukraine. So what we see is a complete misunderstanding about what politics, international politics, is all about. In the Russian eyes, it is geopolitics, it's realpolitik, and in Western eyes, in American eyes, I don't know at the moment exactly what the foreign policy of the United States is. And in
Many people
European
don't.
eyes, it's not geopolitics, but they were playing geopolitics without even knowing it.
right, naive.
Well, they were naive because the European project is a project it's a project nobody knows exactly what it is, but it's expanding all the time.
Putin has signaled his dismay with the United States and NATO in particular, but also Europe generally, for many years now. But it was only 10 days ago that they declared that NATO is once again an enemy, an adversary in their national security policy announced right on New Year's Eve. And to me, that's the bookend from 1991. It's over now, that grace period that we had. And I admit that we in the United States certainly viewed it differently than it was viewed in Russia, including the chaos of the 90s, because we saw it as a great experiment in democracy and transition, bumpy, of course, but nonetheless, even through the Medvedev administration, I think there was a great deal of hope that Russia was on a transition towards some sort of integration with the larger global community, and by that the Western, though I think Western's kind of an old-fashioned notion. And, you know, that honeymoon lasted a quarter of a century, half my life, but it's over now, and we're back to the Cold War.
There's obviously, I'll get to that in a second because that's interesting, but there's obviously no love lost between Putin and Obama. Before we began, you told me the US and Russia at the moment are more alike than you may...
They were always more alike. You can see it in the cinema. The difference between Hollywood and Mosfilm is that in Hollywood, there's not always, but there's quite often a happy
Right.
ending.
But
in Mosfilm, there's not always a happy ending.
Let's stick to the
But-
geopolitics.
They're vast.
No,
Okay.
He's right about the films, though.
In the same national strategy, which was signed by Putin on New Year's Eve, he also aimed for the new position of Russia as a global power. And America is the only alternative, the only other global power in the mindset of Putin. The problem is, I think, that in Russia, they never try to cope with the decolonization of the Russian Empire. I think that the dismantling of the Soviet Union was also the dismantling of the Russian Empire. So they had to cope with decolonization the last 25 years, and they didn't. They were not willing, or they were not able. I don't know.
No, they
I
don't
think
accept
they are
it.
not. No, they don't. They didn't accept it, and that's the reason why they are talking still about spheres of influence and so on, without paying attention to, for example, the fact that there are 55 million people living in Ukraine, who has their own ambitions, perhaps, and their own ideas about the future
Of whom a lot feel very close to Russia also, and also regret a lot of Russian
Less and
Ukrainians,
less.
they also feel very close to Russia. There's a lot of people in the former Soviet sphere who very much regret actually the end of the Soviet Union.
For sure.
So this is not only a Russia phenomenon.
Like the Dutch Empire also regretted when Indonesia became independent.
I don't think that a lot of Indonesians who regret the fall of the Dutch Empire.
Before we explore Indonesia, It's a valid point, but let's look at what Putin has obviously many times addressed the US and the Western. You picked a clip where he spoke in 2007 at the Security Conference in Munich, which is a big yearly event.
I'll explain.
Yeah, please.
So this is one of the main speeches of Putin. This is the speech in the Munich Security Conference, which is a yearly phenomenon in Munich, where all the security bosses of the world meet, politicians also. And he decided in this speech to finally make clear to the West the position, to make clear the position of Russia, the security and the geopolitical position of Russia, and to tell the West, look, or America, the United States, of course, look, we don't agree with your policy, and we are trying to accommodate with you, but you just don't answer, you don't give us any possibility to cooperate with you. Well, and this is what he was saying. It was a very clear speech, so we could have known what would happen.
With the American defense minister in the audience.
Yeah, yes.
Robert Pitts.
Кстати говоря, Россию нас постоянно учат демократии. Но те, кто нас учат, сами почему-то учиться не очень хотят. Мы видим все большее пренебрежение основополагающими принципами международного права. Больше того, отдельные нормы, да по сути чуть ли не вся система права одного государства, прежде всего, конечно, Соединенных Штатов, перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах, и в экономике, и в политике, и в гуманитарной сфере, навязывается другим государствам. Ну, кому это понравится? Кому это понравится? Уважаемые дамы и господа, в заключение хотел бы отметить следующее. Мы очень часто, и я лично очень часто, слышу призывы к России со стороны наших партнеров, в том числе и со стороны европейских партнеров, играть более и более активную роль в мировых делах. В этой связи позволю себе сделать одну маленькую ремарку. Вряд ли нас нужно подталкивать и стимулировать к этому. Россия – страна с более чем тысячелетней историей. И практически всегда она пользовалась привилегией проводить независимую внешнюю политику. Мы не собираемся изменять этой традиции и сегодня. Вместе с тем, мы хорошо видим, как изменился мир, реалистично оцениваем свои собственные возможности и свой собственный потенциал. И, конечно, нам бы также хотелось иметь дело с ответственными и тоже самостоятельными партнерами, с которыми мы вместе могли бы работать над строительством справедливого и демократического мироустройства, обеспечивая в нем безопасность и процветание не для избранных, а для всех. Благодарю вас за внимание.
It seems that every time Putin does a speech like this, our understanding in the West of it takes a while. You know, we always interpret him in slow motion, in a sense.
Well,
did we grasp right away what he said here?
The problem then I was
don't believe him or underestimate him?
People in the West just don't seem to want to believe that he's saying actually what he is saying. But in my eyes, this is what he is saying, and Mr. Meyers was saying this also. We have to believe that what he thinks is that he's acting for the interests of the Russian state, and I think that a lot of Russians also think so. And I think that even in what they are seeing this last couple of years, they are happy actually with what Putin is doing, because in their eyes, this is exactly what he's doing. He's acting in behalf of the interests of the Russian state. And what he's asking here in Munich is to respect the Russian position in the world.
You know what he's also saying, though, and to the European audience, and Angela Merkel was sitting there listening as well, is that you should stop listening to the United States.
Exactly.
And that if you would just if people would stop kowtowing, he used a very crude reference to this just the other day about Turkey and the United States. If the Europeans would accept Russia and not be beholden to this power, then maybe the world would be a better place. You know,
But it is exactly what the
Gates,
Europeans
the
are
American,
doing, isn't
well, some people think so, but I mean, from my perspective, maybe from his, is go ahead and decide. And I think most Europeans are going to be stuck with the NATO alliance more than they're going to be with the alliance
But you
with
know
Russia.
how important the invasion in Kosovo has been.
Of course, no, I understand completely. But the, Robert Gates, the American Defense Secretary who was there, John McCain, you might have noticed, was sitting next to him, one of our real Cold Warriors.
He wants to bomb.
Gates said that
Everything.
we had one Cold War and that was enough. And it was very much trying to, as you said, maybe just either ignore it, this outburst of Putin's, or at least mitigate the damage from it. And the one thing I would say about the U.S. is that a few months, a year after this speech, the United States elected Barack Obama. Dmitry Medvedev became the president of Russia, and if you listen to both of them, they'll tell you that in fact there was a kind of rapprochement in the reset, as they famously called it, and misspelled it. But there was cooperation that was happening, and that sort of effort to, I think, heed some of Russia's concerns was made by the Obama administration. And, Russia joined the WTO as a result of this. There was a new nuclear agreement to reduce the arsenals a bit more, which is very important to Obama, though he's largely failed at it. But nonetheless, there was in this reset progress, I think, made to de-escalate a little bit from that moment.
In Poland, of course.
Absolutely, it's something that I'm not saying all the questions were resolved, but they were
How did
making
how did
progress on missile defense.
Putin can cope with the United States, but he cannot cope with a unified Europe.
Exactly.
Because that is exactly what always was the tradition in Russian foreign policy, to divide and rule in Europe. But it's not by accident that the Congress of Vienna was one of the most glorious moments in Russian history.
Divide
with Metternich and Talleyrand and so on and so on. It's not by accident that Putin, in one of his conferences in Balie, that's a place where they have international conferences with kind of intellectuals from all over the world, is always telling that the Yalta Conference was one of the glorious moments of Russian history. And that were exactly the moments where Russia was able to divide and rule in Europe, at the continent.
And there's a lot of people in Germany. Actually, I should say that I'm living in Berlin, and where the narrative about Russia and Putin is much different from that in the Anglo-Saxon world, and also in Holland. And so in Germany, there's a lot of understanding actually for Putin saying, Europe, okay, become more independent from the United States, and don't get involved in invasions like in Libya or or elsewhere, or don't cooperate with the Americans when they want to bomb Kosovo. And there's a lot of understanding for these political positions, because actually these Germans who think so, they think that he is right. And there's a lot of anti-Americanism in Germany, and those people, they see the Americans and the United States much more as an aggressive power than they see Russia. And this is also something we have to understand and we have to deal with, to understand also the balance of power in Europe, because Germany here is the most important power in Europe. So we have to understand also the sentiments and the feelings and the ideas in Germany about Russia, which are very different from what the Americans or the Dutch are thinking.
You brought a clip as well. Do you want to introduce it yourself?
Yes, I think that 2012 is a turning point in the life of Putin. Before that, you could say he was the Secretary General of the Politburo 2.0, a kind of network of bureaucrats, businessmen, oligarchs, etc., etc. In 2012, he was re-elected, or elected for the first time in the second round, let's say it in that way.
Medvedev stepped down.
He stepped down, and he was crying before an audience, big audience, in front of the Red Square.
Or was it cold?
It was cold, yes, it was cold. I spoke also a few times with Gleb Pavlovsky, his spin doctor at that moment, who left before the election because he was not, as he told me at least, he was not ready to accept a third term of Putin. And he said, Pavlovsky, and I think he's right, that Putin was really crying because the first election victories he perceived as a victory of the team, the Kamanda, the whole network of Petersburg who worked together with him. In 2012, he perceived the election victory as his personal victory. At that time, he became a washed Wojt is the leader with a capital L, something like Führer or Duce or Caudillo in Spanish. And at that time, he became, the person Putin became the same as the president. And he became let's say the Tsar. Not the Tsar. Yes, he was sent by God, and he became the state himself.
Let's take a look.
It's like the Rolling Stones coming up.
But younger.
Vladimir Putin!
Dear friends, first and foremost, I would like to thank all the citizens of Russia who participated in the election today, and especially I would like to thank those who have gathered here in Moscow. I would like to thank you all those who support us, all over our big homeland. Thank you, everybody, all those who said yes to a great Russia. I asked you once, will we win? We will win, and we have won. We have won in an open and fair struggle.
Since men in Russia don't cry, he was blaming the cold. Is that?
Yeah,
It was a bitter
one of
wind.
the interpretations, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think he was really crying.
And
And
besides,
he said in the same speech, he said in Russian, "No pasaran." So they, and that's very important. Also in Russian, that has some symbolic connotation.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that he said that he thanked everybody for voting for Russia, not for him as leader.
Right.
Which perhaps is political rhetoric, but nonetheless, it was interesting the way he set that speech up. In particular, in fact, that whole campaign as being a divide and conquer. The young people who had been up to that point, in fact, the night before that, protesting in the streets, were the people that you were voting against. And it very much split that society into the for and against camps, with the radical opposition becoming essentially an enemy of the state, as opposed to being somebody, who just simply voted against the leadership or wanted another candidate to win. They became actual enemies.
well, I was going to say, when you said earlier that Putin talked about how Russia was being strangled, here we judge that Putin is strangling his own state in a sense as well, and especially the civil society. Russians know this as well, or at least part of it.
Many of them do, and many of them have left since then. Many
Right.
people were arrested the
young
night
people.
before that speech, and many have been arrested
So who
since.
stays? I mean,
People who can't leave. I mean,
Right.
there are also very loyal Russians who
loyal
admire
to
him.
Russia or loyal to Putin?
Both, but a lot of people who are in the opposition for some reason, and I mean that in a very broad sense, not just politically. People who are in business, but whose business interests perhaps clash with somebody close to Putin, are leaving the country. Sergei Guriev, a very well-known economist who worked for Medvedev, felt he had to leave the country. People who work with Alexei Navalny feel like they have to leave the country. I had a conversation with Boris Nemtsov a couple months before he was murdered, in which he said he understood why people left the country.
The
But
opposition,
Boris Nemtsov, for those who
Balie,
don't know him,
I
is one of the great Democrats of Russia. He said he would stay because this is his home. And he didn't want to leave. He loved Russia. And he was a great patriot that way. And so there are many people who stay and make an accommodation with the power. There are many people who have no choice. One of my good friends, a colleague who's not a rich person, has bought a house in Italy so that they can retire there if they need to.
But the average Russian cannot buy a house in Italy. So the problem also is that we correspondents who are writing about a country, of course we meet with the elite. It's the elite who is leading. Which Russian guy can just go to DC and build a life there? He's rich. right? He has possibility. He's an
It's
intellectual.
not so much,
So it's-
actually. You'd be surprised. I mean, the guy who made the steam for me in the Balie each Sunday comes to America now.
But
And
it's
so
not the
not
average
rich
Russian-
people, not rich people.
it's not
I
the
mean,
average Russian
middle
that's-
class, yes, but not the oligarchs and the super wealthy who don't come to Washington. They
No,
go
but
to
my
London
point
or
will
New
be
York.
that
but
after Putin felt betrayed by the middle class, who went out in the streets to protest against him, he put all his political power on those people.
the divide that I was talking about. yeah.
The average Russians, who also admire him, also because those people who they consider to be betrayers leave the country. And you were talking about a civil society and about the opposition being the enemy. In the mind of Putin and in the mind of the Russian political elite at the moment, everyone who is against Putin is against the state because, as Hubert said just now, he became the state. And to be against the state in Russia, it's the first crime, actually. It's the worst crime you can commit. And he is the state. And every opponent, even if they are Democrats, they are enemies. So in their eyes, they are enemies of the state, and they are paid by the West.
How does there are many things about Putin that I wanted to discuss, but given the time, we'll go to audience questions in a few minutes as well. But how does the interference in Syria that happened a couple of months ago by the Russians fit in? Because that also seems
Russia?
like a unifying
Less
theme in
positive
Russia.
than the interference in Ukraine.
Right. But why did he
Because
decide
it's far
to
away,
go about?
because the remembrance of the Afghanistan war is still fresh, and there is no ideological aim.
Then why do it?
Because Putin wants to be the leader of a global power.
Right.
First, second, Syria is the only place in the Middle East where Russia has still some interest at stake. But by the way, take care with the category civil society. The civil society has never existed in Russia. So if we are talking about civil society, we are talking about ourselves, not about Russia.
Well, and
that's also the reason-
NGOs such as Memorial, or I mean,
yeah, okay.
wouldn't you call that civil society?
You can mention. You can,
But that's
you
only
can
a few.
call that civil society.
And they've
But
now
that's-
been
that
declared a
only
foreign
exists
agent.
in Moscow.
Exactly,
It only exists in the networks, in the atmosphere, in the circles of the intellectuals, etc., etc. But there is no civil society on a more, let's say, on a lower level.
I don't agree about Syria, though. I think what Putin is trying to do is to become the leader of the Christian world, and
I agree.
Of the
Christian,
Christian
world.
world.
And he knows that he will have a lot of supporters with this in Europe, what perhaps are now the fringe parties, but the parties that can become much bigger, like the Front National and all the populist, right-wing populist parties in Holland, who think that the West is at war with Islam. And he knows that he has a problem in the Caucasus with Islam, and obviously because of the Chechen wars. And he's trying the last couple of years to become an international leader. And this is one of the platforms on which he's trying, in my eyes, to become this leader.
I agree. But in Russian society, Ukraine is really more important than Syria.
But I think the Russians think that he's beating the hell out of Chorny Jope in Syria.
Yeah, that's also a nice side
You have
effect.
something to add about the Syrian involvement?
I would say a couple things. That notion of playing to the Christian world, I accept that that's part of what you've seen in his latest term as president in terms of portraying himself as a protector of traditional values. But I don't actually believe that domestically in Russia that's what he's doing, because a very significant part of the population in Russia is Muslim, and they're also Sunnis, and they are not going to appreciate, I don't think, the Russian government bombing Sunnis in
But this
Syria.
is exactly what he was doing in Chechnya, and there's a
I
lot of
understand,
Chechens fighting
I understand that, but Putin is always very careful, again, despite the caricature of being a raving nationalist, to not play the nationalist card, because he understands that Russia is in fact a multi-confessional and multinational country, and he gets a lot of credit in a country notorious for its anti-Semitism, for example, of not being anti-Semitic and not being racist. And
But
while
thank you.
on the TV and some of these nationalist figures bubble up every now and then when they're needed, to be honest, and then they disappear again when they're not needed. And you saw that in Ukraine as well with Novaya Rossiya and all this. These themes bubble up, but Putin is very careful, I think, not to play that that religious card
This is
too
very
much.
important. You are right on this.
And he's careful about that. And
But when he thanks people for voting for Russia, isn't that playing the
I think
nationalist card?
it sounds like it, but I think that he's trying very carefully to create a much more of an imperial type thing, not just a Russian Orthodox presidency, because that is a dead end, and that will lead to the separatism of the Caucasus. The last thing I would say about Syria is that I know from reporting on that this summer that there was a lot of intelligence coming back to the United States, where I was at the time, saying Assad was about to fall,
Right.
and as always, our administration misread Russians' intentions in response to that. And so John Kerry came, if you remember, in the summer, negotiating the way to work with Russia to have a transition. And John Kerry was wrong again. And Putin was not interested in a transition. He was interested in shoring up the Assad government. I think that there are a lot of reasons for that, historical and geopolitical, the Russian base there and so forth. I do believe that they spin it for the domestic consumption at home, and it is harder because of the experience in Afghanistan. Right now in Washington, there's a great debate going on of how much more we should be intervening in Syria. And there's a real reluctance, and certainly on the part of this president, for us to get involved in another disastrous war. And I mean, the last one didn't go so well.
So he's playing field for himself.
I think he's intervening for very clear reasons to shore up Assad, and they spin it the way they do. And at least I haven't been there since the bombing started back, in Russia in September, but it does seem that when you deploy forces, as you do here, as we have, there's an initial rallying around your country as it is, fighting at war. Sort of no questions asked. You support your soldiers in action. Rightly so. I think that's a normal human instinct. It's only later when it becomes a prolonged engagement. The one thing about the Russian intervention is that it has solidified Assad's government, but it hasn't dramatically shifted the civil war, and it's a nasty civil war, and it's not going to be solved soon. So how long can he sustain military presence there? How long can he sustain it if they start losing pilots? They've lost one to the Turks.
They control the airspace now.
Let's stop if I can. Maybe there'll be an audience questions about Syria as well, since it's obviously important. But before we get to this, a last and very important question, which we can talk about for another hour, I think. But you said the Cold War is back. We've heard that a lot over the past months. You talked about the imperialist motives, perhaps. What's his end game, and how long will he be with us? Because if I'm not mistaken, in 2018 he could get re-elected for another 6 years. I guess he will be if he wants to, which means we're talking about 2024, which is 8-9 years from now. I mean, what eventually does he want?
We touched on this earlier, sort of like what in his speech in Munich and so forth. I've often wondered, what would it take for the United States to make Putin happy? And I think, how do we surrender to him? Do we just give up? Do we say, Ukraine is yours? Yeah. I mean, most people, I think, look at Yalta and think that is so 20th century, where they were supposed to be beyond that now. Yeah. So what would it take to make Putin happy? And I think it would be that we would never utter another word about a journalist being killed or an opposition leader being killed. It would mean that we would take all of our money and interest out of Ukraine, out of Syria. I mean, it's. But
is that smart or likely?
No, I'm just wondering, how. I think if we did that, when we've tried, as I mentioned with the Obama reset, I speak of the United States, try to accommodate Russia, it doesn't seem to be enough either.
Right.
And that's why I think, given where Russia is right now, given where the United States is, and God knows where it'll be after the next Trump administration. Think about that for a few minutes. And
will you stay?
He says it'll be better, but but I'm just saying is that I think as long as Putin is in power the way he is now,
it's American politicians like Hillary Clinton calling Putin Hitler. It's not the Russians saying Obama is Hitler, but vice versa.
My point being simply, and I'll end on this, that it's not going to get better soon.
Well, not with Hillary Clinton in power, no.
No, I agree with you.
And also the Americans should just stop like inviting punk bands like Pussy Riot to the White House. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is not the way this is not politics. And this is what the Russians are saying.
Was Pussy Riot invited to the White House?
They
No,
were
but
invited
only
by
on TV.
Hillary. They were on TV.
They
with
were on the
Hillary.
White House press correspondence dinner, which is not quite the White House. But
But that's a very
I mean, this-
realpolitik way of arguing as well. I mean, if,
this
if
is
the
part.
US
This would be
stands up-
part of the surrender.
In Russian
is that we
eyes,
just
it's
don't do
ridiculous.
anything to
And
annoy
this-
Russia.
Right.
You know, and this is not. I mean,
But
the
the
Russians
US
will
has its
accept a
own,
lot.
America has its own values and its own.
Well, what kind of values are these? Like, you know, this was a band that was like playing a rock concert, let's say,
Right.
in the St. Peter Cathedral.
Right.
If you compare it to our situation. So we should stop playing with this type of propaganda, and I think this is also what the Russians want the West to do, and just be going into politics again. And then the Russians will accept a lot, of course. If the West would just accept the Russian interest, the Russian sphere of interest, perhaps, and just deal with this, then of course the Russians will also accept a lot of those, in our eyes, bizarre aspects of.
Would that be the way to finish off to prevent more situations such as in Crimea and eastern Ukraine?
No. No, Putin is dividing rule now in European politics. He is buying,
then what is
he's
his
buying the
endgame?
Front National in France. He is looking forward to a referendum in the Netherlands, the 6th of April.
Then what is his endgame?
His end game?
Yeah.
Oh, that I don't know. For sure, I know that 2017 will be a key year for Putin, because then the money is played. How you say that in English?
I think it's played. Gone.
All the sovereign wealth funds of Russia are spent next year. So because there is a real economical crisis going on, but there is no political opposition in Russia. So he can stay for a while, but he has to cope at least with the economical crisis in Russia, and he has to rethink his social contract with the Russian people, because the social contract is now under pressure. The social contract in Russia is very simple. I pay you a higher pension and you shut up. That is the social contract in Russia. And now he cannot pay anymore next year, perhaps. And then we will see. But I don't know if he will be able to cope with this. And chaos in Russia is absolutely possible after 2017.
There are no optimists at the table, perhaps in the audience. So we'll go to questions, meaning questions and not essays. Keep them brief if you can, because then our guests can talk longer. And we'll do that for about 15 minutes. So whoever has a question, right here.
Thank you. I have a question about the God and about the belief in God. I think that Putin does believe. He doesn't fake it. And I'm not speaking now about the church being part of the propaganda and being really now close to politics. I'm really asking about what does a belief in God makes for Putin, how does it shapes the way how Putin acts, and what influence it has on him, on his personality.
Is that a question for Mr. Meyers?
You can't really know what's in somebody's heart to say they are not a believer. I believe, in fairness, he says he is. I think we should take him for granted on that. I have a colleague, Geraldine Fagan, who wrote a terrific book on religion, the Russian Orthodox Church, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's called Believing in Russia. I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic book if you're interested in religion in the former Soviet Union. She told me that when she sees him in events in the church, that he is not accomplished at the rituals, some of them, and that could be simply because as a KGB agent, he simply would not have allowed to have been religious, outwardly anyway. But his mother baptized him, he says, and I think it's important to him in searching, as many Russians are, for what do they believe, post-Soviet. I think that many have turned to the church. They wear it lightly, Russians generally that I know, even ones who go to church perhaps on the important holidays, on Easter, on Christmas, but they're not active in the church in the evangelical way, for example, in our country or among Catholics that I know. But there are nonetheless, the church has undergone a revival in Russia from what was horrific repression during the Soviet era, and it's an important part of his politics, regardless of his belief. He was on Christmas just a couple of days ago, the Russian Orthodox Christmas, in a small church south of Moscow, and the Christmas holidays are played up in ways that were inconceivable in Soviet times. So I think it's important. Again, we were talking about the traditional values and stuff that he sought to portray. The way that the Pussy Riot protests, which in defense of America, I will say we do believe in free speech, and even in Russia, where that was seen as blasphemous, it was a very, very short protest. They were only on the stage for a few minutes, but it's interesting the way that we approach that as a free speech issue, but in Russia it was portrayed as a blasphemous issue, and it really divided even the opposition. People like Alexei Navalny said that while he supported their right to free speech, he didn't think they should be dancing on the altar.
I think in the Western
and just to finish, that notion, the way that the church as a defender of the state and of values and all that, of course, is very influential to Russian society at large, I think.
Well, I want to say that I think that in the Western context, if the Sex Pistols would have done the same thing in the St. Peter Cathedral in Rome, a lot of Western people would have thought this was blasphemous.
But they wouldn't have put him in jail for 2 years.
That's the difference.
So
that's when you are in Russia.
That's quite a difference.
Yeah.
Well, that's what Russia is about, of course.
Right. More questions? First row.
Yes. Hi. I haven't heard the word Tsar actually this afternoon. And where are the comparisons with 100 years ago?
I didn't hear the word what?
Tsar.
Tsar.
Oh, Tsar. Okay.
Actually, it did come up a couple times, and the notion of the leader separate from the state is where I thought it becomes justifiable to describe him as that. Charlie Rose, one of our TV anchors, did an interview with him just before his most recent visit to the U.S., to the UN in September, and asked him, people call you the new czar, what do you think? And I wish he'd held up the book when he asked the question. It would have been nice. But nonetheless, Putin demurred, of course, and he said, I consider myself the elected president of Russia, of course. And, fair enough. But I think the aspects of his power, the near universal adoration with which he's treated, in not just in the media, but in all official discourse, the reverence, the remoteness of him as a leader who is inseparable from the state, who is almost unimpeachable, has an aspect of the czarist tradition. I mean, Soviet secretary generals also had that remoteness, I think, in different ways. Stalin was nearly as remote and as much of a father figure for the nation, I think, as a mere secretary general. But nonetheless, I think that with the role of the church in the state, with the notions of empire and all that coming back, I admit it's a metaphorical title, but nonetheless, I think it's appropriate.
More questions? Yeah.
Wait. It's for the people at home. Sorry. Oh.
Good afternoon, Addison Holbrook. You briefly touched upon how Russia and Putin is looking more towards the east, towards China, because you were discussing the future and the unipolarity of America versus the new idea of the bipolarity between America and China, the rise of China. I was wondering, how do you think the relationship between Putin and China will grow in the future, and how will it affect the West?
You brought this up. Why don't you start?
He needs some time to think. So
I have a very strong answer, but I'll defer.
You're the guest.
Putin sees China as a natural ally against the evil United States. The Chinese love American dollars, and that in a nutshell is Putin's problem with China. There's no question that relations with China and Russia have improved, and Putin is certainly seeking that. And when the sanctions after the events in Crimea, the American and European sanctions were imposed, they suddenly announced this great deal with the pipeline to China, which has yet to be consummated because the Russian ruble has tanked, and the energy market, of course, is going through an enormous upheaval, which has nothing to do with just Russia. And the Chinese have their own problems right now. But I think it's important to understand that the Chinese are a very practical government, and they are very mercantile, to be honest. And, I'm not a China expert as much, but when you look at the relations, they're very happy to work with Russia. They're very happy, I think, to have good relations with Russia. I think Russians generally are very much afraid of the fact there are 1 billion Chinese and there are 4 million people in Siberia just over the border. I don't think China's going to invade Siberia, but many Russians do. So it's a balancing act that Putin is trying to seek. But I think that the Chinese, if they were pushed, would rather have good relations with America than they would with Russia.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I would like to add 2 things more. The policy of vector, the Eastern Asian vector of Russia is very risky for Putin himself too. For the mercantile policies of China, it's not by accident that the so-called Silk Route is a route not through Russia, but through the Central Asian states, Kazakhstan. And there's only a very small railway line to Moscow from the new Silk Route. First, so the Chinese are more counting on Kazakhstan, I think, than on Russia. And the second thing is that still 75% of the Russian people are thinking that the future of Russia is in the West and not in the East. And the Levada Center, one of the opinion poll centers in Russia, polled 20 years ago the Russian people, and then 75% said very strongly that the future of Russia was laying in the West, and now 75% of the people, not so strongly, but still are thinking that the future of Russia is laying in the West. So Putin has to deal with us more than he would like.
Because of the pressure of its own people.
Yes, his own people, yeah.
Uh-huh.
It's one thing when I talk about East and West. For a long time, I was trying to get our newspaper to stop saying the West. When I was in Russia, I mean, it was Russia the West, Russia the West, or Russia in the East, Russia in the East. I mean, the world is changing now, and it is infinitely more intertwined globally than it ever has been. And Putin thinks in this Yalta sense of spheres of influences of East and West. And frankly, I agree that is old-fashioned thinking. And that China doesn't think of that. I can even say Europe.
Stick to countries.
Don't underestimate the amount of people in Europe who are also still thinking in Yalta terms.
I understand.
One of the main political...
But in the world today...
We come to the Putin
No, Bolkestein was a liberal leader in the Netherlands in the 90s. He openly in a lecture in Oxford said that we needed a second Yalta conference.
I understand.
And he's perhaps crazy, or he's, but still he said it.
The point I'm making more generally is that, that I think these notions of you can just turn from one part of the world to the other. The Obama administration announced a pivot to Asia because, enough with the Middle East, right? Enough with Europe. But in fact, you can't pivot away from Europe. You can't pivot away from the Middle East. The world now is so integrated that you have to be able to understand all of the problems at the same time and deal with them.
But in the new security strategy, the Kremlin is using the West as ideological.
Very much so. So that's why I'm worried that we're back to that kind of regional confrontation. And frankly, I think it's an outdated notion on the part of the Russians.
So how are we then getting? If the main problem at the moment internationally is political Islam and its aggression, and we know that we need Putin and Russia as a partner to fight political Islam, so how is the United States, because they're the main, they're the most important country in this battle, of course, how are they going to accommodate Russia in the end? And how would it be possible to become partners with Russia again?
You know, when you look at the situation in Syria right now, or in Iraq, I guess as well, but certainly with the Islamic State, it seems to me, speaking personally, that there is no question that there should be common cause against what is a nasty, evil force. And I mean the Islamic State. I'm not talking about even just extreme Islam. And the United States and Russia in Syria can and should be natural allies in that, as well as all civilized nations, I believe. The problem that we have is that we have such a fundamental difference of opinion as to why the Islamic State has risen. And I'm not saying the United States is right on this, but Russia sees Assad and the central, frankly, authoritarian government of Assad being the bulwark against the rise of radical Islam. The same way Saddam Hussein was the bulwark against the sectarian divisions we see in Iraq today. And I don't want to rehash the debate over the Iraq War, but the removal...
That may take a while.
Yeah, we could be here for a couple more. I'm happy to come back and have an Iraq discussion because I spent a lot of time in Iraq and have dealt with this. But in Putin's mind, you remove Saddam and what you have is chaos. And you remove Gaddafi and what you have is chaos. You remove Mubarak, you had chaos. Thank God you have Sisi now to try to get the lid back on it. And that's why he's intervening, at least in his mind.
So far he has been right in many of the examples you mentioned.
I would not argue with him in some of these examples. But you look at the Turks, for example, and they're intervening to try to topple Assad. The Saudis are, the United States does not believe Assad can be part of a political solution in Syria. So if Putin, Russia, and Iran, by the way, are supporting Assad as the solution, and we're opposing Assad as a solution, even though we're fighting supposedly the same enemy, you're going to have chaos. And I hope really, for the sake of the Syrian people who are suffering so badly, that there will be some kind of resolution that can unify all of this. But I think even at this point, if the United States and Russia and Syria and Turkey and all the other players got together and said, let's fight just the Islamic State, they were in for a long battle nonetheless.
We have time for one final brief question here in front.
Is Putin already organizing how the transfer of power will be after him? We were discussing about Tsars. There is a normal line of inheritance. What is the way it will be done later on in Russia?
Good question. Who's next?
There is a grandson, so there's an heir. I think that in seriousness, I mean, Putin and people close to him like Sergei Roldugin, Yakunin, people I've talked to, they'll say that he is not going to be president for life. That it's important to him not to be a Lukashenko or Nazarbayev, some sort of dictator. So I think in his mind, and he believes that he has adhered to the letter of the law, and by stepping down the way he did, even though he just became prime minister and effectively was paramount leader, it was important to him to be legitimized. And I think that when the next election comes up in 2018, he will run again, and his vote is the only one that matters, so he'll be reelected. And then in 2024, now 8 years from now, you'll see the same kind of internal debate and paralysis that you saw in 2007 before the end of his second term, when no one could conceive of a Russia without Putin at the helm. And he came up with his artful compromise of putting his closest aide in as president and staying around essentially with his handle on the handlebars. And I think that as he gets older, he's going to be looking for the same kind of transition that will allow essentially Putinism, whatever that means, at least the political system that protects the business political elite that exists in Russia today will somehow continue. And Medvedev would be a natural person to lead that again. He's a young man. He's 3 months younger than I am. So I would not be surprised to see Medvedev as president again, or somebody very much like him in 2024.
Unless one of the other two completely disagrees.
Well, he has 2 daughters.
Okay. One of them was in the Netherlands, but not anymore,
yes,
right?
In the Netherlands, yeah.
Still.
No, she's.
My understanding is
left
she's back in
the Netherlands.
no, back in Russia.
Back in
Yeah,
Russia.
she left the Netherlands. Yeah.
Okay, we'll see. Thank you so much for coming from Amsterdam, Berlin, but especially from Washington. Read the book, it's for sale. The other two Putin books are for sale as well. And thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone. Thanks.
Citizens of Russia, friends, in a few moments we will see in the new year 2016 the sensation of this wonderful moment between the past and the future is familiar since childhood. We look forward to it with joy, hope and excitement, believing in the best. There are a few seconds left before the new year. Let us wish each other success and happiness. Let us thank each other for understanding and support, for sympathy and responsiveness we give each other. And let us raise a toast to the prosperity and well-being of Russia. Happy New Year to you. Happy 2016.